Number 4, Genesis, 2nd quarter, 2022. Jon Paulien.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this oasis in time where we can come together as fellow believers and drink of the knowledge that you have produced through Dr. Jon Paulien. Bless each one of us, open our hearts and minds to receive what is needed for us individually. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.
All right, so at this point we come to the flood story as a major piece of the early part of Genesis. And if you'll take out your handout and go to number 1, you'll see that it says, read Genesis 6:5. How does this build on the story of creation? And how does the definition of God's people change from Genesis 4 through Genesis 6? Why don't we start with 131, Terry, if you would read that for us. That will get us started.
God saw that everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day.
So basically, it's saying emphatically what had been said many times over in chapter 1. God saw that it was good. With that in mind, let's read 6:5, Genesis 6 and verse 5.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually.
And so this seems to be deliberately building on Genesis 1:31, and it shows the tremendous extent that evil had taken place in the world, whether it was 1,500 years or more, depending on different chronologies of the Bible. During that period of time, things had gone from the image of God all the way to evil constantly, all the time. So in Genesis 6:5, it is worded in such a way to recall the goodness of creation and the sharp contrast. But here's an interesting piece. The Hebrew word for God was sorry, or God regretted, is the word nacham, which is also the word from which you get the name Noach, Noah. And Noach means not so much regret as comfort. So it's one of those Hebrew word plays. You have God regretting, and then he brings comfort. So the evil situation suggests a judgment is coming. On the other hand, God sends comfort. He sends Noah to offer a promise of mercy and hope in the world. And the question was raised, I think, in one of the earlier chats about the idea of remnant. The very first mention of remnant in the entire Bible is here in the flood story. And it says only Noah was left. So Noah was a remnant of the wicked world that we perceived through the first chapters of Genesis. And the question is asked, how does the definition of God's people change from Genesis 4 through Genesis 6? And just reminding what we did last week is that you have the sons of God and the sons of men. That was the division in the world that came in when you went to chapter 5 of Genesis. But now it's even further. Only Noah is left. So up until this time, the world has been kind of 50-50. God has his people. There are the others who have rejected God, and both lines are moving along. But when it gets to the flood, things have reached such a place that only the family of Noah is left. They are the remnant of the faithful. And from this, I think we get the idea that God planned that Israel would be the means to bless the nations. It was his purpose that Israel as a people would be his missionary nation. But it wasn't too far into the monarchy period when it became evident that Israel at its best wasn't going to get the job done. And that's when the language of remnant becomes frequent and applied to a subgroup within Israel. So if you're interested in the remnant concept, it has its root here in Noah, that God had in mind a whole body of people that were called the sons of God who would manifest his image in the world. But in the end, it was down to Noah and his family. So let's refresh ourselves on the basic story. Let's read from Genesis 6:13 to 7:10 to refresh the basic narrative of the flood in our minds. And as she reads, you could ask yourself the question, how does the flood story relate to both creation and the Exodus within the narrative of the Pentateuch? How does Noah respond to the grace of God, and so on? All right, so Genesis 6:13 through 7:10.
And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its width, 50 cubits. And its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds. Of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come in to you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came on the earth. And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the water of the flood came on the earth.
All right, let's go back to the beginning of that. Something I noticed as we were reading together in chapter 6, verse 13. God says, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So I think the average person reading this, especially for the first time, is going to say, wait a minute, destroying the earth, isn't that violence? God says it's because of violence that I will destroy the earth. What do you do with that? How would you explain that to the average person on the internet or on the street? All right, Iris?
This is such a challenging topic right now while we are recording, we are all shaken by the enormous amount of violence that we hear about in the media taking place in Afghanistan.
When a place becomes basically a place where people are only in survival mode, when all human caring seems to be gone and everybody is just surviving for himself, for their own self-interest. It's not a great place to be.
It's a shocking place to be. And I would ask the question to the person on the internet, what is the solution? What responses do we have left? No matter what we think, how Western countries have acted here. But there is a question sometimes, is there even still a good response left? And God is in an even bigger predicament, because basically the future of his plan of salvation hinges on the survival of the few godly people that even care to listen to him.
You mentioned Afghanistan. 6,000 soldiers were sent over there to evacuate people. Why do you need soldiers? Why couldn't the people just go to the airport and fly out? It's because there were many who were seeking to prevent that it would be dangerous. And so in that particular situation, the threat of violence was necessary to hold back violence. So just interesting analogy. Neil.
Sometimes it takes violence to save. The surgeon uses a knife, which can be used to kill, but he uses that knife to save.
All right. Thank you. These are very, very helpful thoughts. We'll come back to that because I want to ask the question in an even more pointed way in the next section. But first, a couple other things, observations from the reading. First of all, it talks about an ark, and the Hebrew word for ark is also used in another place, and that's in Exodus chapter 2, where it is the vessel in which the baby Moses is hidden, and in the bulrushes. Remember that story? It's the same word, tevah. It's an ark. So in both cases, the concept of ark is associated with rescue from a very threatening situation. So God provides an ark. Does God wish to destroy the human race? Absolutely not. But he provides an ark, and there's no vaccine passports at the door. Anybody who wants to come in can come in. There's no visas necessary. There's no stipulations. It's simply the ark is there. If you believe in what God says, if you trust his word, all you have to do is enter the ark. And you might ask the question, what if some bad people entered the ark? Well, none of them did, apparently, but the call was there. And were Noah and his family saved because they were good, or were they saved because they got in the ark? So when God provides a means of counteracting the violence, counteracting the sin, counteracting the destruction, when God provides a way out, trusting God means taking the way out, even if it doesn't make sense to you. Never rained here. Why would it start now? Well, God said, get in the ark if you want to be saved. Come with me if you want to live, says God. And if you don't trust that, you won't get in the ark. But if you do trust that, then you might get in even a week or two before you think it's necessary. All right, Carlson?
In order for God to be able to have a venue to have his son explain to the earth and the humans and the whole universe, he had to have a venue for that. And Noah being the very last person, he either had to possibly let it die out, or he had to do something to make it so that he could ensure that his son would be able to be brought to the world in somebody besides the mother of Jezebel or somebody like that, which was not going to be appropriate. And he didn't want that. So I just had to jump in on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Henry?
I believe that the statement of God saying that he will destroy the people is more a description than a prescription. As you were saying, he also provided a means for people to avoid to be destroyed. So all of the inhabitants of the earth could have chosen to go into the ark, and that will not happen. So he described that he was going to destroy the earth, not because that was the intention. So I will change that term of violence, because that was not the intention of eliminating that. Other than that, he would have given the opportunity to be saved. So violence will be, if my intention is actually to annihilate everything, so then he didn't even need to warn them. he just should have done it.
So the very fact that God is warning them even 120 years ahead shows a tremendous patience and a willingness to work with whoever is willing to be worked with. Yeah. On what basis was Noah saved? Within the story itself, it says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But then in Hebrews 11:7, he was saved by faith. He's a hero of faith. He trusted what God told him. He did what God told him to do. So Noah's salvation is by grace through faith. We saw that in Genesis 4, but here again, you have to dig a little bit to get there. But here again, you see that these Old Testament stories are evidence. They are expressions in practical terms of the gospel. And it's clear that Paul believed that, because he often said, the gospel has come to us through the scriptures, and we are just passing that on to you. Iris.
The fact that Noah had faith and trusted God found also expression in the way he conducted his life, because Genesis 6 verse 5 says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. That is, he was in sharp contrast to this triple-fold wickedness, right? And he walked faithfully with God. And so I think whether we trust God or don't has profound implications for the way we live our lives. Noah resembles the character of God in the way he conducts himself. And the people who do not trust God mirror basically the Lord of this world and his character within a very, very short time after creation.
And we saw that very clearly last week, didn't we? How the human race degenerated very, very quickly once it was infected with sin. One other thing I wanted to point out in the passage that we read is verse 22, Genesis 6 and verse 22. It says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. And we've noted this before in a previous lesson, but once again, this is the word asa. It's the word for creation. It's the word for building something, making something. What Noah did was build the ark. He made the ark, but it's the language of creation. It's the same word also as building the tabernacle. So scholars have pointed out there's an intimate connection between creation, the flood, and the Exodus, and that some of the same language is used in all three places. And therefore, the Garden of Eden is like a tabernacle. It's the place of refuge. It's the place where God's salvation can be found, just as the tabernacle, the temple is. And in a sense, the ark is as well. It's the temple. It's the holy place for the world when at the time of the flood. Let's go to 2 Peter 2, because there's an interesting New Testament, how shall I put it? It is a theology, if you will, of God's interventions in the Old Testament. 2 Peter 2 and verses 4 through 9.
For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until the judgment, and if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood on a world of the ungodly, and if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction and made them an example of what is coming to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man greatly distressed by the licentiousness of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by their lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, especially those who indulge their flesh in depraved lust and who despise authority.
All right, so Peter here is doing an interesting theology. He's not just mentioning the flood story, but the flood story is part of it. In verse 4, he starts with the angels, that God separated the disloyal angels from the good angels. So you could say that separation was like a rescue. They were not allowed to continue mingling in heaven. He spared Noah, but brought the flood on the rest. He rescued Lot when Sodom was confined to the flame. So Peter makes 2 points about the flood story and others. God is able to rescue, and God is also able to restrain evil. God doesn't always intervene, as we saw in the Cain story. God doesn't always intervene to stop violence, to stop evil from doing its work. But God is able to restrain evil, and with the big picture in mind, he will do so. I think that kind of comes a little bit in the direction of what Iris and Neil were saying earlier, that God was doing rescue operations. And Matthew 24 adds one more thing to our understanding, and that is the suddenness of the flood was like a foretaste of the end of the world. I got in the mail just recently a chart of end time events, and it came from people I respect very highly and appreciate their work quite a bit. And I think there's a lot of interest in understanding the future and understanding what prophecy tells us about end time events. But one piece that always troubles me a little bit is alongside texts that tell you, well, this will happen and that'll happen and that'll happen. There are texts that'll say it's going to be a total surprise. It's going to come suddenly when you least expect it. And that suggests to me that locating ourselves on a prophetic chart may not be the most helpful thing, but that perhaps if we are ready for his coming today, then we will be ready if he comes tomorrow. That this day, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. The most helpful message, I think, about the end time is not to delay or to wait for our deliverance, wait for the time to get ready, but to be ready every day. Let's go to number 3. And it says, read Genesis 7:1 to 8:1. And perhaps, Terry, I'll take this on myself because I want to stop numerous times in this text, because the question is, what parallels do you see between the flood story and the creation account? And what do these parallels tell us about God? All right, so let's stop right there. What parallels are there between the flood and the creation story, and what do they tell us about God? So I'm going to go through pointing some of them out, and when we're done, I'd like you to respond to those questions. What do these parallels tell us about God? All right, Genesis 7:1, the Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Anybody see a parallel to the creation story there? I don't, so it's okay if you don't. All right, but then comes verse 2. Take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. All right, that's translation language. But in the Hebrew, you have here the number 7, which is very common in the creation story. And you have the male and female, which you have also in the creation story. So there's a couple of allusions there to the creation story, the number 7 and the male and female. Larry, you have a comment.
A comment on the verse you read and your question. And you've already made a statement at the beginning that the reason Noah and his family were saved is they showed up and got on board. And the statement that Noah was righteous in his generation, I think that's a very comforting way of indicating that in his generation, which the Bible goes to great length to describe how unholy that generation was, he was righteous in that generation, which may have meant that had he have lived 800 years earlier, he may have been a different kind of person with that same degree of, and I'm just going to call it righteousness. Please don't read any more into that phrase than what I'm intending. But I did find it insightful that there is such a thing as, call it generational righteousness, that in 2021, being a righteous person, however that is described, might be different than it was in 1842 versus 1492. I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we hold people up as an example, and we are constantly trying to live up to somebody else's example of what kind of a person they were, we should take comfort from the fact that what we're really being worked with is in our own level where we are. Am I understanding the phrase of that verse wrong?
You're suggesting maybe when it says righteous in his generation, it doesn't mean righteous in an absolute sense, but that compared with the rest of them, he was the most faithful one. We do know later on he had some alcohol issues, for what that's worth, so he wasn't perfect in an absolute sense. But I think what God is looking for is what we're capable of. He desires a relationship with us. He desires a response, and it's for our own good that we would make such a response. And God is looking for what we are capable of. And that gives me encouragement, because there may be people who have never heard the gospel, yet they have done more with what they had than some of us, for whom we have great knowledge. With great knowledge comes, of course, great responsibility. Let's go to verse 3. And also 7 of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. All right. In this every kind of bird, maybe I should have Terry read it, because the NIV is being very creative with the text. But in the Hebrew, it's the birds of the heavens, the birds of the air is the Hebrew expression. And all of the parallels I'm going to give you are parallels in the Hebrew, even though in the English they might be confusing. Verse 4, it says, 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. The face of the earth is not the face of the planet, it's the face of the ground. And that peculiar language, the face of the ground, is found in the creation story as well. Verse 5, and Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. We've already mentioned that. It says several times that Noah used the language of creation in the things that he was performing. Verse 8, pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds, and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark, as God commanded Noah. So you have here animals, birds, creeping things, male and female. Verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. Now, in this verse, you don't have the language of Genesis 1. So this one is different in that sense. But what it does talk about is you have the waters below and the waters above. If you remember in the creation story, God said, let the waters be separated into the waters above and the waters below. So there was a suspension of a large part of the water up in the atmosphere, and the rest was in the ground. And so you have waters above and waters below. In the flood story, the rains came down and the floods came up, right? In the children's story. So the two that God had separated in creation come back together. So that's a deep hint of what's going on here. What we have is in the flood, a reversing of creation. You go to verse 14, you have animals, birds, creeping things after its kind. Verse 15, breath of life. 16, male and female. 17 through 20, the waters cover the earth. When did that happen before? The very second verse of the Bible, right? And the earth was completely covered with water. It was without form and void. So the waters covered the earth. Verse 21, animals, birds, creeping things. Verse 22, breath of life. That's a recollection of Genesis 2. Verse 23, the face of the ground, animals, birds, creeping things, etc. So the question is, what do all these parables tell us about God? Anyone want to take a shot at that? All right, Lou?
Well, God never gives up on us. His long suffering, his patience, his love is beyond our comprehension. But he just never gives up on failing humanity. He just keeps working. He's sending the Holy Spirit, and Jesus came to show us who God is. And the Holy Spirit, after Jesus ascended, has come to dwell within our hearts. God just had a plan from the very beginning that we have a hard time fully grasping his great love and his redeeming power.
All right. So we see God working in creation, but he's also working in the midst of the flood story. And that language calls us, in the midst of the disaster, we're called to remember God's great mercy in creation. Yeah. Iris?
In creation, the triune God is intimately involved in creating life, the possibility for life, creating an environment in which human beings can flourish, and plants and animals. And the Holy Spirit plays a vital role in it. And it appears as if that reversal that happens during the flood, it is almost as if the Holy Spirit is removed from the scene. So instead of the life-giving power, the life-sustaining power of God that holds everything in his hands and makes life possible, because we have rejected that Spirit of God, as if the Spirit is withdrawn and then everything disintegrates.
I'm very intrigued by what you've said, and I want to point out Genesis 8:1, which is one of the most exciting parallels between these texts. It says, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now, I think you all know from previous sessions that the word for wind and the word for breath and the word for spirit are the same in the Hebrew language. So when it says God sent a wind over the earth, it's repeating Genesis 1:2. He sent the Spirit over the earth. So that kind of suggests, Iris, that the Spirit was coming back. In the recreation, the Spirit was coming back. So perhaps the Spirit was withdrawn in the context of the flood story. So what you're saying makes some sense to me in the light of what the text actually says. Larry?
Two thoughts along that line. What's it take? 7 minutes to read this story? Not very long. Took Noah from the day they entered the ark until the day he comes out, almost 13 months to live the story. In the popular childhood myth that we have is that they enter the ark, it rains. They're there for 7 days and nothing's happening. There's like plenty of time for the kids who said, okay, Dad, we trusted you. Nothing's happening. Come on, how do we get out of here? So nothing has happened. And then things that they have never experienced before begin to happen. Unless you believe that God brought a different level of conscious awareness to the animal life and to the human life, there had to be some concern on the part of humanity and of the animals that were inside the ark, because this is going on. Yes, it's a big boat. I've been on a very large boat in an ocean storm. It is not a comfortable place to be. Even when you trust the captain and you believe the boats and you know where the life preservers are, it is still an uncomfortable thing to live through a violent storm. So, I have all of this going on. That's part A that I wanted to make. Part B is Noah has to remember, and I'm certain in his mind there was no doubt about the creation story. Unlike many people today where we have a lot of doubt about the creation story. So the parallels that are going on here in the story, because they're being recited afterwards, this is how Noah is telling the story, that in his mind, while these things are happening, he's connecting the moment with what he understood the creation story to be, understanding that God is there. I didn't make a mistake. This is all going to work out.
All right. In the chat, Carlson asked the question, are we talking about righteousness as grading on a curve? And I would respond, not in God's eyes, but very much in our eyes. And what comes to my mind there, for example, is the thief on the cross. By any human way of comparison, this guy was a terrorist. He wasn't just a thief. He was somebody who was very, very violent. Remember, Jesus was replacing Barabbas, who was one of the zealots, terrorist type. So Jesus was placed in the middle of the worst kind of people. And yet, a thief on the cross is saved. Why? Because he entered the ark. Jesus offered him a step, and he took it. Yeah, we can use different kinds of language in it, but I think that God considers where we've been born, where we've been. And what really matters to him is the commitment of the heart. That's what this whole business of faith is all about, this whole business of trust, that when the heart is right, the works will come, but they might not come in the way that, in the immediate sense at least, that some of us would say, well, this person's better than anybody else. That God recognizes what the person is capable of, and the change in their lives is an evidence. Somebody who's on drugs and smoking and something comes to God and they give up the drugs, we say, well, there's a lot more to go. But in God's eyes, the giving up the drugs may be the evidence that they are truly connected with him and that the process has begun and good things are ahead, you see. So human eyes, we may not always understand the decisions that God makes in regard to human beings, but in God's eyes, he has a singular eye for who is on his side and who is not. Sandy?
Well, I see a great parallel here, how God allows us to have choice and to take it as far as we can with what's happening today. We have great violence. People ask, where is God? But he's giving people a chance. And in the flood, he finally had to put an end to it. And today, with all the violence and giving choices, there will be a time when he'll have to say, this is the end. We can't go any further.
All right. So God knows what the world can handle. He knows what the universe can handle. And all other things being equal, the worse things get, the clearer the distinction is between God's character and the opponent. This is evidence of what the universe would be like, the whole universe, if Satan were in control. And as much as we'd like it to be gone tomorrow, the longer it lasts, the more obvious the patience of God is, the better God looks. And the longer it lasts, the more evidence there is that it'll never start up again. So we're asking challenging questions, but these are the kind of things God would love us to stretch our minds over. Now I'll get to a very, very tough one, interesting one. Was the flood an active judgment by God or a natural result of sin? What do you think? Carlson?
I think this one was not punishment, but it was a preserving of the path to the Messiah. And I think that God, each situation all the way down through the ages, including Sodom and Gomorrah, whatever it is, he hurts the fewest people to achieve his purpose of showing who he is. We would be in bad straits if we hadn't had the flood. If Noah had been the last person that was righteous and we never had Jesus come, it'd be awful. And we probably wouldn't be here to start with. But I think God, in his mercy, inflicts as little hurt as he can to make things happen the way things have to happen to show his true character. And I think that was one of the things.
Okay, as I'm hearing you, you're saying this is kind of like a holding action, restraining evil so that God's plan can move forward. Did I hear you right?
As Maxwell would have said, it's an emergency measure that had to be done. Otherwise, the whole plan of salvation was gone.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? As I look at what the options are, it seems to me that there are at least three that one could take and answer this question. One is the more Calvinistic approach, and that's the idea God is sovereign over all things. He created us, and he has the right to terminate us. Get over it. All right, so that's the idea. God manages everything. God is in control of every detail. If there's evil in the world, it's because God has a purpose in it. And so if God decides to do some destroying, that's his business. It's none of your business. All right, that's one option. And I think it was perhaps in reaction to that you come to the one that Carlson that you mentioned that Graham Maxwell was in favor of. And that was that these are emergency measures. They're active judgments of God in an emergency. And I think I've listed about 4 different types of active judgments of God. I may not be able to remember them off the top of my head, but one would be to hold back evil. Another would be to rescue God's people from trouble. And wouldn't we all want God to rescue us when we're in trouble? And that might sometimes take active or even violent action at times. So another one would be to get people's attention. God sometimes judges aggressively in order to get people's attention. It's hard to get to. So the idea that these are emergency measures, that God is doing a difficult action in order to rescue his people, in order to restrain evil and keep his work alive. A third approach is the idea that the flood is the natural consequence of human sin, that in a sense it was inevitable. And I'll be interested if anybody wants to argue for any of these three. All right, Henry?
I don't see it, not a judgment, nor a natural consequence, but definitely an action of God, not with the intent to destroy human beings or to destroy sin, because if that was the intention, he failed. Immediately after, there was sin and human beings continued. So I don't think that was the intention. It was not the intention either to have a good people, because a lot of people became against him immediately after. So I see it as a demonstration for the onlooking universe that force and might don't change human beings. That God could have destroyed everything and said, we will redo this one more time, and now we are going to go in the right direction, and that would have changed absolutely anything. So the perspective I have is God trying to demonstrate the onlooking universe that even if he using all of his power, he will never stop seeing, because it has to be with the later demonstration that is going to come thousands of years after, that the only way to win this war against his character assassination is by showing who really is.
So are you suggesting in option 4 that in the flood, God is demonstrating that such forceful action doesn't really solve the problem? Okay, thank you. Very interesting way of expressing it. Ashley?
Earlier in this conversation, you talked about the firmament and the waters under the earth. And somehow, as this flood story goes forward, these things change. There was a significant change in this physical structure. So what brought about the change? And I guess some people suggest, and it seems reasonable to me, that the people who lived on earth didn't really want a traditional, to them, relationship with God, and they wanted him to withdraw. And when God withdrew, there were consequences that changed this physical structure that existed prior to the flood event.
So are you creeping toward option 3 there? The idea that perhaps this was a natural consequence of human sin?
I think I am, yes.
Okay, I offered the 3 options. I didn't think number 1 would go far, but I thought 2 and 3 might be interesting for most of you. Iris, you said something similar when you talked about the Holy Spirit being withdrawn. And so are you attracted to this number 3 idea that maybe in the end, this was a natural consequence?
Yes, I think so. And I think this whole judging, I must say, whenever we have bad things happening, there are believers or Christians who say this is a judgment of God, whether it's the upcoming of AIDS or whether it's COVID. And I find that very troublesome. I struggle with these attributions. I struggle to attribute to God these destructive acts. But I do believe that our choices have consequences. And I believe even in the spiritual realm, we are in fact judging ourselves. I don't see God in the end even as someone keeping us out of heaven. I believe, and I think it's biblical, at least the way I understand it, that our choices judge ourselves. So I think that's true on an individual level. It's true on a collective level. And while God's life-sustaining power is redemptive in nature all the time, because he respects human freedom and choice, there are limits as to what he can do for us. And that rejection is ultimately what causes these catastrophic events.
You see, these are interesting conversations because the typical Christian answer to that person on the street would be essentially number 1, wouldn't it? Hey, God created it. If he wants to take it away, that's his business, you know? Yeah, well, I wanted Joe to stay around, but God needed him more than I do, or something. You know, you hear that so often. And for us to explore other alternatives, I think is healthy here. Daniel Keto.
I would combine 2 and 3, but maybe I would give a little more depth to 3, or at least more speculation on 3. And that is that if one thinks about the scientific revolution, we're about 300 years into that. Now, if you would speculate that in the pre-Diluvian world, people were living up to 900 years or thereabout. It's very possible that someone like Einstein could have started the scientific revolution and all by himself lived through 500 or 600 years of that. If you sort of think about the kind of ideas that could be generated by a group of people or a whole number of people as far as science goes, it would dwarf anything that's happening today. Absolutely dwarf it. And if you think of how they might mess with the earth in that process, look at how we mess with the earth. Some of the catastrophes are strictly man-made. So that if you sort of think about what man might have done to the earth pre-Diluvian, it's highly likely that maybe they did such horrible things that the catastrophe, God saw the catastrophe coming in 120 years. And he said to Noah, get ready. So I think most of us were grown up to think that the pre-Diluvian people were nice, primitive kinds of people who were just lustful. I think that they were pretty scientifically advanced. And I think that's why we have no remnants of them. Because I think that if we could get some of the information they had pre-Diluvian, we would be a lot further along the path in science, but also, I think, in evil.
Imagine if Isaac Newton was still alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
300 years later, still accumulating knowledge and coming up with a clear understanding of physics. Yeah. And you have a whole world full of people with that kind of knowledge and understanding. Larry.
I'm wrestling because on the one side, I like the scenario that Henry painted. That fits more with the picture and the concept of God that I have. But then on the other side, there is a rational part of me that can see, having had a wife who died from cancer, I understand what cancer does to the patient. And so I understand that sin is a cancer, what it does to the patient. And we really don't have a whole lot of complete understanding of what condition the world was in. And 120 years could very well have been its natural trajectory to completion. That's pure speculation. So with that in mind, people will say this is the tension of the story, is that on one hand, we know very little. On the other hand, there's the picture of God. And God clearly states that the condition was that he needed to do something to begin over. And yet he didn't begin over. The Noah who got on the boat is the same Noah that got off. And all of the family were the same. So somehow or another, that connectivity needs to get put back into this story to understand whether it was natural consequences or an act that God felt he had to do to make a statement.
All right, Terry?
I actually can see a blending between Iris and Henry. And the part that I would blend from Iris is that our actions judge ourselves, with Henry's part of the demonstration of the failure of power and might. Power and might being imposed upon us doesn't change our minds. And us, I mean humanity. And it seems like that we need a demonstration over and over and over again, multiple times, in order for it to make the impression. Because if what Henry says is true, that God needed to show that a demonstration of might and power doesn't work, well, isn't that where we were with Jesus when he came to the earth? That might and power doesn't make the change in us?
All right. Let me share just something that struck me as we were talking, and several of you have poked at different parts of it. But when you go back to creation, because one of the arguments against the worldwide flood is the idea, where'd all the water come from? Okay. I mean, how are you going to cover all the continents with water, et cetera? But I think we're in a unique situation because at creation, half of the world's water was suspended up in space above the atmosphere, and would be one reason why the entire world was mild, where it had a perfect moderate climate, as we understand from non-biblical sources. So if that water was suspended above and other water underneath, that was suspended by the power of God. And God doesn't stay where he isn't welcome. He leaves reluctantly. He often leaves slowly. We saw that with Cain. He looked away, and yet he stayed engaged with Cain as long as Cain would allow it. And finally, Cain walked away, and that was the end. And still, God kept him alive from a distance, so to speak. God respects human freedom. And when you have an entire planet that's saying to God, we don't want you, and God respecting that freedom, as God withdraws, what would happen is the question. Maybe Dan has an opinion on this, but it's been suggested to me that it would take a lot of heat to suspend that much vapor in the air. And that as God withdraws, perhaps the sun even lost some of its power, that it wasn't as hot as it was before, as the presence of God was withdrawn. And then the water vapor begins to condense, and it cools, and you have a 40-day downpour, and all the waters above and below comes together, and the earth is truly covered over, and then the continents get raised up, etc. That's kind of speculative, but the point is, I've often thought it's got to be a direct intervention of God. How would it have happened otherwise? And yet one could envision possibilities that it might have happened in a more natural way. Anyway, we can leave that aside, except that we do have some possibilities for at least suggesting to people some good reasons. I think we've come up with 3 emergency measures, a demonstration, and we'll come to that, Henry, actually in the next one when we get to the Tower of Babel. That is a demonstration that what God did at the flood didn't convert anybody. It just scared them, and so they built a tower to survive the next one that comes. So the flood accomplished nothing in terms of converting the world, for sure. So that piece is well taken. And then the idea that we may find out in the larger scheme of things that God did not take a direct hand, but that he simply accepted what human beings asked him to do, and in the process resulted in the destruction of many. All right, coming to number 4, and let's see, our time is starting to draw to a close. Let's go to chapter 8, verse 1. And Terry, why don't you read that for us?
But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided.
All right, the Hebrew word for remembering, zachar, is a little different than ours. For us, remembering is kind of like getting over Alzheimer's or something. You forgot something, and then, oh yeah, now it's coming back to me. All right, well, God doesn't forget, okay? So when God remembers, it's not saying he recalls something that he forgot. It's rather saying that what he always knew and always held in mind now is going to result in action. And when God acts, what does he do? He sends the Spirit to calm the waters. Why don't you read verses 2 through 5?
The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared.
All right. So you have here that when God remembers, he acts to rescue, this time not just Noah's family and the inhabitants of the ark, but to rescue the whole world. And through the return of his Spirit, things change, the waters begin to recede, and normalcy gradually returns. But then Noah, in verses 6 to 12, we won't take time to read it, Noah starts sending birds out and stuff. He opens the ark. It's not raining anymore, so they open a part of the roof, and they're looking out, and he's sending birds out. Did you notice that God hasn't said a word to him since verse 4 of chapter 7? So Noah went through this whole experience, as far as we can tell, without a communication from God. From the time they entered the ark until this time here, about 10 months, no communication from God. So what is Noah doing in sending out these birds? Is that an evidence of faith or of a lack of faith? Noah's out there, well, I don't know what's going on here. Let me go find out. Is he acting in faith or in lack of faith?
It's a faith-based in evidence.
Faith-based intelligence. What in the text would lead you to that?
He is opening the window, the opening to the heaven, and he's sending that bird because he is expecting something to happen. And that's based on evidence. He is not just blindly thinking that something miraculous is going to happen because as things have happened. So he's acting, putting his reasoning to work and find the perfect moment to get out of the boat. But he's expecting getting out of the boat. That's why he sends the bird, because he knows it's going to be a time, but that cannot be tested only until the bird doesn't come back.
So if you have any ideas why Noah is sending out these birds, for the first time in the story, he's acting on his own initiative, which is rather interesting, because if he just wants to inspect and he has this window, maybe he could see, but he still sends the birds. In chapter 6 and 7, all his action was a response to divine commands. And now, for the first time, he's acting on his own initiative. Dan.
I think so often we think we should wait for directions from God. At least in my life, I have come to think that God would like for me to use his great principles, but act in sort of a mature way. And that it's been my experience when I am really off the mark, God does something to sort of rein me back in again and keep me out of doing something really stupid. And so it seems to me that this is a positive thing, that Noah had heard from God. He knew he had to get off the boat sometime, and he began to explore in, I think, a very logical, scientific way when the appropriate time might be. So I would say that Noah was doing what I think was really a very rational approach to trying to figure out when the right time would be to debark, because he knew he had to do that sometime.
So what's the purpose of the raven? If it survived by eating carcasses, why does it need to be taken back? If he didn't survive, why did he take him into the ark? Doesn't seem that logical to us reading it in 21st century, but yeah. Iris, and back to Jon, then Jon Paulien.
Well, what comes to mind is also experientially, when you go through a time of darkness, there is often, from a subjective perspective, the impression as if God has left the area. All you see is the turmoil, the darkness, whatever. Whether that is because you are really in physical circumstances, or that can also be the dark night of the soul spiritually. But I think a person of faith goes back to God and basically expects him to respond in some kind of a way that reassures. And that is how I am connecting with that story from my personal walk. I think the person who really doesn't trust God, they just give up. But the believer, I think, is always looking expectantly in the direction of God to respond in some kind of a way. And he has confidence in the goodness and faithfulness of God to respond again, to direct again, because we have seen the light before. So at some point, he will speak again, even through a branch of an olive tree or whatever.
In my view, these were acts of faith. I would say that because when it became clear that the ground was dry, that the flood was over, they didn't move. They stayed in the ark until God told them to leave. So whether that was Noah alone or whether the whole family was agreed on that, there was faith involved in the timing of when they would leave the ark. And they were waiting for God's instruction. And the silence of God for that long period, I think we can really relate to what that's like to experience. But Noah was determined, and that was his righteousness. He was going to do whatever God told him to do. And if God didn't, then he didn't. And we see the same thing in Jesus, that he often said, I'm here to do what my Father says. And you want me to go to Jerusalem? My Father's not telling me that right now. So I can't go. Even though it would please you, I'm not going to go. And then a couple of days later, God says, okay, go to Jerusalem. And he goes. He's not controlled by human ambition or human ideology. He operates under the instructions of God. So, yes, I think Noah was truly, as Hebrews says, a man of faith. It's time pretty much to draw to a close, but I want to lead you to one more thing that I thought was pretty exciting in this lesson. And that's in number 6. And it starts with Genesis 9, verses 8 to 17. I encourage you to read that on your own. But in that, God promises them. By the way, the word covenant appears 7 times in this passage. The first time the word covenant appears is not until Genesis 6, where God says to Noah, if you'll cooperate with me, I will make a covenant with you. So God promises him a future covenant in chapter 6. That's the first time the word covenant appears. But then in chapter 9, he uses the word over and over again, and it's associated with the rainbow. He said, this is the sign of the covenant. This is the sign by which I will demonstrate my faithfulness to you, and it's the rainbow. It's interesting that there's another sign, and that sign is in Exodus 31. That sign is the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is a sign of the covenant of creation. The rainbow is a sign of the covenant after the flood. And the lesson author points out that the flood story parallels the first 6 days of creation. There's a reversal of creation. God undoes creation. The rains came down, the floods came up. Everything that God separated and distinguished. He separated the dry land from the sea. Now it's back to the original condition of the world before God created. So it's a reversal of creation. And then a restoring of creation. If we had more time, we could go through and note the details of how piece by piece God is putting the creation back together again. But this part here in Genesis 9 to 17, parallels the Sabbath day. And that's the piece where the rainbow comes in. The rainbow applies to the whole world, and so does the Sabbath. One of the toughest challenges that Adventists face in making the Sabbath a point of issue with other Christians is that Christians will point to the fact that God keeps the Sabbath in Genesis 2, but Adam doesn't. It doesn't say that Adam kept that first Sabbath. It doesn't say that God made the Sabbath for them.
It's interesting that in chapter 9, God says, I'm not going to destroy the earth again. So it's the commitment of God towards his creation. Terry, if you can read 8:21. It's a very interesting argument when God says,
And when the Lord smelt the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done.
Now, interesting, he says, the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. The only humans alive are Noah and his family. And we just discussed how he was obedient, that he even 2 months after the end of flood, he was waiting for the signal from God to go out. So he's different than Adam and Eve. So there is hope. After Cain and Lamech, which we had in chapter 4, there is hope for future humanity. Yet God says the inclination of human heart is evil, which shows that the goodness is not hereditary. God can see things are going to get worse, but God is committed to the future of creation, and he's going to find a solution. It cannot be provided by showing his power. The water can take care of the wickedness, but before long, it will be back. And so the story of Noah ends on a positive note. To paraphrase the words of Armstrong, it's a small step for a man, but huge leap for humankind. Stepping out of the ark, it's a small step for Noah, but a huge commitment for humankind that God is committed to resolve the problem. Dan?
I've always wanted to ask you this question, and that is in regards to the flood. Did God really want to do that, or was that partially a concession, in addition to everything we've said, to other worlds? I suspect many of them were saying, why doesn't God do something dramatic? Why doesn't God intervene? Question that John has been raising throughout these last couple lessons. And it seems to me that in some respects, God allowed natural things to occur and for things to devolve to the flood as a response to what the universe was demanding. And as someone just said, the results were not so terrific as far as the universe was surprised at how little effect it did have. I've always wondered the question of to what extent did God respond to some of these bigger questions that maybe other people in the universe were asking.
Yeah, so that provides an interesting perspective, that if you see the flood not only from the perspective of humanity, but for the perspective of the intelligent beings in the universe. And of course, you have Zechariah 4:6, nor by might, nor by power, but by my spirit. So later writings are going to indicate that certain things cannot be resolved by using power. And of course, flood would be a prime example of that not before long. Both the story ends when you look at the structure. So there is an offense and there is God's judgment on the offenders, and Noah finds grace in the eyes of the Lord. Then you have the middle of the story, God remembers Noah, but at the end of the story, you will have Noah and his 3 sons, and there will be a judgment on Canaan. So even within his family, there is offense of sexual nature. You have a sexual offense at the beginning of the story, sexual offense at the end of the story. And then the next story will be the Tower of Babel, the next lesson. But God is committed in spite of the fact that both within Noah's family you have problems and humanity will have problems in the Tower of Babel, that he is going to resolve the problem in some other way, because the way that was illustrated in the flood did not work out.
Well, Daniel,
okay, John is back.
You may not be into baseball, but you're a good pinch hitter. So it's been going well each time. I think I know what the problem is. There's nothing I can do about it until we get off of this line, but we'll try not to let that happen again. Where was I cut off this last time? So I can either add something or close the meeting.
You were talking about the Sabbath as a sign.
Let me just finish that up a little bit. So you see here that there's a couple of sign commandments. One is the rainbow and the other is the Sabbath. And each of these, the rainbow was a sign of the covenant with Noah. The Sabbath is a sign of creation. And many of our fellow Christians argue that the Sabbath is not important because it was just for the Jews, that once the Christian faith came along, it no longer needed the Sabbath because the Sabbath came at Mount Sinai. After all, Adam never kept the Sabbath. God kept the first Sabbath. And when the 4th commandment comes, it doesn't say anything about Adam and creation keeping it. It just says the Sabbath is a memorial of creation as given to the Jews. But there's one place in the Bible, and that's Mark 2:27, where Jesus says the Sabbath was made for the man, not the man for the Sabbath. He's referring to Adam. At creation, the Sabbath was not made for God. God doesn't need to rest. The Sabbath was made for human beings. It is made to bless us. And so you have the rainbow as the sign of Noah's covenant. The Sabbath as the sign of God's covenant with creation. And so the Sabbath, just as the rainbow is for everybody, so the Sabbath is for everybody as well. So here, as we've studied Genesis 9, we see an additional grounding of the importance of the Sabbath for the people of God. Let's close with prayer. We thank you, Lord, for the time we have had together. We thank you for some of the challenges that stories like this face us with. But we're also grateful that you were willing to take the risk to be misunderstood in order to lay out a huge amount of evidence for those who care, for those who are open to you and are willing. You can walk us through these scriptures and bring us to a deeper and deeper faith in you. And for that, we thank you. In the name of Jesus, amen.